Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. First hour, we're going to spend some time kind of backing away from election 2016, but we'll get back into it in the second hour because, after all, today, 149 delegates on the Republican side are at stake: Hawaii, Idaho, Michigan, and Mississippi. And we certainly want to hear from some of you that perhaps are voting today or looking ahead to the next Super Tuesday, where you will have 358 Republican delegates at stake in places like Florida, Illinois, Missouri, North Carolina, and Ohio. But in this first hour, I wanted to address some issues that are a little broader, but I think relevant to this. We have a level of political polarization that is certainly unprecedented today. In many cases, even Gallup polls show that we are now more divided politically than at any other time in the post-war era. And some are suggesting that maybe we're in the midst of some kind of social revolution, and that is certainly the premise of the author of this new book, Shattered Consensus, that we may be headed for a fourth revolution. We'll talk about those first three and what that might mean and what's happening in the economy, what's happening in politics, and what has actually happened in terms of this decline of the post-war political order. And some of that was brought about, simply, interesting enough, by President Obama, who, in trying to bring about a renewal of liberalism, actually presided over its disintegration. So a lot to talk about in this first hour, and so we bring to the microphone Dr. James Piereson. He is with the Manhattan Institute as a senior fellow. He is also the president and trustee of the William E. Simon Foundation, holds a Ph.D. in political science from Michigan State, but also has been teaching at such places as Iowa State University, Indiana University, the University of Pennsylvania, holds a lot of background in a number of different areas, serves on a number of boards. And Dr. Piereson, it's great to have you on the program with us today.
Kerby, great to be with you today.
Well, Jim, let's, if we can, maybe get into some of this. We have talked about on this before, the possibility that we're in the midst of sort of a disintegration, a shattered consensus. And in order to understand your idea of a fourth revolution, can you kind of tell us what the first three were? Take us through American history for just a minute so we understand what you're talking about.
Well, Kerby, I say in this book that America seems to resolve its deepest problems, political problems, in relatively brief periods of upheaval and reform. So we've had three of these periods in the past. The battle between the Jeffersonians and the Federalists that was resolved in favor of the Jeffersonian Party in 1800. Then the breakup of the Jeffersonian system in the 1850s, producing a new, leading then to the 1865 to 1930 in the Great Depression, when that system fell apart. FDR and the New Deal, the 1930s and 1940s, created a new system. Coming out of the Second World War, American leadership in the free world. Both of these were ideas in the 1920s that no one fathomed. That is, a large national government and the United States as a dominant power in the world. That was not thought of in the 1920s, but in that upheaval of the 30s and 40s, that's what we came out with. And people look back to the 1950s and early 1960s as a period of general consensus in America, both from a religious and cultural point of view and from an economic point of view. President Eisenhower let stand the New Deal reforms. Religion was strong, family was strong, large families. In that whole period, in 1960, Nixon and Kennedy ran for the presidency, and both those candidates said that there wasn't much to distinguish them from one another. Kennedy asked Arthur Schlesinger even to write a book which would delineate the differences between the two candidates. So, of course, some of that came apart in the 1960s. We did have an upheaval in the 1960s. Ronald Reagan put some of that back together in the 1980s, restored American pride, and got the economy going together. And, of course, the Cold War ended. And that produced 20 years of good economic growth. Bill Clinton brought the Democratic Party back to the center. But since the year 2000, the two parties have moved very far apart. The moral consensus in the United States has also, I think, frayed a great deal to the point now where the two parties appear to represent two different nations. As you look at the primary elections, the two parties, the candidates in the two parties seem to be talking about two entirely different countries.
Yes.
So that's kind of where we are. I think everyone recognizes the parties have polarized, and we don't know where this is going to go. I think the Obama presidency took the Democratic Party off to the left, and of course the Republican Party is in complete turmoil today. I guess my argument, I guess I have two thoughts about where we go from here. One, do we resolve this somewhat in the way that we resolved it in the past, say with a decade-long period of upheaval leading to some resolution? That could happen. The second thing I fear, though, is an extended period of stalemate.
Yes.
Where the country is so divided it can't really address its major problems, and things just grow worse and worse. People become disaffected, and the nation loses its capacity to govern itself.
And again, I have, Jim, sometimes tried to explain to our younger listeners, of which we have quite a number, that they don't know what that was like. But there was a time in which you had Republicans that were moderate or even liberal, whether it was Nelson Rockefeller, or you had Democrats that were relatively moderate or even somewhat conservative, Sam Nunn or Scoop Jackson. If they're under the age of 30, even if they're under the age of 40, they've never really seen that. And in some respects, a Ronald Reagan still could bring some of those together. Now, if you're pro-life, you find no home, for example, in the Democratic Party. Matter of fact, if you even have lots of positive things to say about capitalism, you may not find a home there. If you are really starting to talk about issues of income inequality, or a number of other issues, environmental issues, sometimes you don't find a home in the Republican Party. And that polarization, which after we take a break here, is something I want to get into a little bit more, because it illustrates that we may be headed towards, as you said, another revolution. So we'll talk about what has been leading to, if you will, kind of the demise of this particular consensus, things like debt, some of the demographic realities, some of the economic growth that's slowed, and those kinds of things, and then what that looks like in the future. And then we're going to also get into maybe what we can talk about in terms of how that has been influencing all sorts of different arenas of our society, including even education, which are some of the chapters in your later part of the book. So we want to get into all of that, but we do have one of those mandatory breaks. And if you have just joined us, talking today with Dr. James Piereson, he is a senior fellow with the Manhattan Institute, also president and trustee of the William E. Simon Foundation. You may have seen some of his previous books on Kennedy and on some of the American ideals, but this one is entitled Shattered Consensus. We have information about him, information about the book on our website, and we'll come back and spend some time talking with him. A little bit later, we'll give you a chance, if you'd like, to join our conversation. In the second hour, we're going to spend quite a bit of time getting back into election 2016. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The current vacancy on the Supreme Court highlights the ongoing debate about how to properly interpret the Constitution. The late Justice Antonin Scalia wanted the High Court to interpret the Constitution the original way the founders intended. An originalist would argue that words have a distinct meaning and are written to convey that meaning to any generation. Likewise, the Constitution was written to communicate a particular meaning yesterday, and that still applies today and will apply in the future. An originalist recognizes that some circumstances have changed since the drafting of the Constitution. For example, our modes of travel are different. But the goal is still to understand the original intent of the framers and apply those foundational principles to the contemporary situation. Apparently, the founders of this country and the framers of the Constitution were concerned that we might drift from these principles due to incremental changes. James Madison is considered the architect of the Constitution. He warned, "I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpation." In the middle of the 20th century, there were many who began to describe the Constitution as a living and breathing document. Chief Justice Earl Warren proposed that the Constitution should be interpreted in light of the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. Associate Justice Thurgood Marshall was even more explicit when he acknowledged, "You do what you think is right and let the law catch up." So the framers were concerned that future justices would not adhere to constitutional principles. That's why the U.S. Senate should also be concerned. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Focus Features and Motive Entertainment present The Young Messiah, a story of Jesus as a youth, in theaters March 11th, rated PG-13. YoungMessiahResources.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us this first hour Dr. James Piereson as we talk about his new book, Shattered Consensus. It is published by Encounter. We have information about it on our website and would certainly encourage you to read that as we talk about the rise and the decline of America's post-war political order. One of the illustrations you use, Jim, in the book is that sometimes as we look back as military historians, we recognize that generals oftentimes fight the previous war. You see that in, for example, Gettysburg, where they were fighting it almost like the American Revolution, and First World War fighting it like it was in the 19th century. There is a sense in which when we hit the 2008 financial crisis, President Obama, in a sense, went back to the New Deal kind of mentality and the teachings of John Maynard Keynes. Is that fair?
Yes, Kerby, I think that's absolutely correct. When Barack Obama was elected, he thought, and many people thought, that he would be the new FDR. And he would embark upon an economy, and he would create a new revolution in American life that would lead to the domination of the Democratic Party and liberalism for another generation, much in the same way that FDR did. Of course, that turned out to be false. FDR gained seats in the 1934 midterm elections, added to that in 1936. But Barack Obama lost the House in 2010, lost the Senate in 2014, as the public rose up and rejected those bold designs. So after 8 years of the Obama presidency, we're more divided than ever. Unlike as would happen in the 1930s, the country was on the road to a kind of a new consensus.
Sure. And think about this. Again, I would use this for my younger listeners or those who haven't studied history. You could have gone into many homes in America in the 1930s and seen a picture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the living room. Just think about that today. I mean, I can't think of too many homes. Now, going back to maybe the 1980s, or sometimes I walked in homes and saw pictures of Ronald Reagan, but I just, I don't care even if people were loyal Democrats, you go in and see too many pictures of Barack Obama in the living room. So I think it shows you the remarkable difference between those two individuals who, in some respects, saw themselves identically. Even times, isn't it fair to say that Barack Obama refers to and sees him taking the mantle, if you will, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
Yes, I totally agree with you, Kerby, that you wouldn't see Barack Obama's picture on many homes across America today. Of course, I think one of the things he tried to do was to repeal Ronald Reagan's revolution of the 1980s, which many Democrats still today regard as somewhat illegitimate. But of course, we had a good 2 decades in the 1980s and 1990s under the policies that President Reagan and the Republicans inaugurated. We're not there any longer. I think we're now, as I suggest, into something of a new era. That era that started really with Ronald Reagan is pretty much over, it would appear.
Right.
Now, with Antonin Scalia's death, the Supreme Court divided 4-4. It looks like the Supreme Court is tipping one way or another. We may even lack the agreement in the United States to appoint another justice of the Supreme Court. You may need 60 votes in the U.S. Senate for a president to appoint another Supreme Court justice.
Yeah, and I don't know, no matter who we elect, and of course right now it looks like it could be a Hillary Clinton or a Donald Trump, but it could be somebody else as well. That's a difficulty. And so I think it comes back to a point that I've been trying to make. It almost doesn't matter who we're electing as president. This polarization and division will continue. And that comes back to another premise of your book, and that is this kind of demise of this post-war era due to debt and demography, some of the demographic changes and things like that, as well as just a slowed economic growth. Can you kind of explain why this is taking place? In some respects, this has happened no matter who we elect as president, but it certainly has been accentuated and accelerated under President Obama, hasn't it?
Yes, indeed. I think the United States faces several intersecting problems going forward over the next decade or so. One big problem is that our economy is not growing as rapidly as it did in the post-war period. The post-war average growth per year is about 3.5% from 1950 to the year 2000, and it slowed down to 1.5%, 2%, even without the collapse in 2008. So our economy is not growing fast enough to allow people's salaries and wages and incomes to increase. It's stagnating. That's one of the factors behind a lot of the unhappiness and anxiety out there in the American public today. On top of that, we've accumulated enormous amounts of debt.
Yes.
Not only in the last 15 years, but really going back a distance into the 1970s. So we have $19 trillion of U.S. government debt out there that we have to pay off, and even at today's very low interest rates, that's costing us somewhere around $300 billion per year, or 7, 8, 9% of federal spending. If interest rates should go up, double, triple, as they have in the past, that would be an enormous problem for the United States to handle. On top of that, there is an enormous amount of corporate and consumer debt out in the country. The total of public, corporate, and household debt is about $60 trillion today, compared to a GDP of about $18 trillion. So our economy today, $18 trillion GDP, has to support $60 trillion of debt. That's one of the factors that's leading people to slow down their consumption. If you have to pay back debt, you can't spend it on new cars and refrigerators and appliances and all sorts of other things.
Which kind of leads us to this whole idea of the revolution, because it seems to me that that's only going to go on for so long. We know if you were to make this an individual that is actually 5 times more indebted than their actual annual income. Of course, there is a difference between a country and an individual, but still you can see that this is leading to this idea of a fourth revolution, whether that's revolution with a capital R or small r. That's really something that seems like it's certainly on the horizon, don't you think?
Well, yes, that's one of the things I suggest in my book. I mean, we could add the demographic issue, which is basically the retirement of the baby boomer generation,
right.
Which has now begun to happen. The baby boom generation is those born between 1946 and about 1964. About 80 million people, about 25% of the entire population. They're all retiring beginning in 2011, reaching age 65, and that will continue for another 10, 15 years, out to about the year 2027 or so. And they will be drawing Medicare and Social Security. There are about 60 million people today on Social Security. In 10 or 15 years, there might be as many as 80 million people. And this is a system that's already fairly significantly in debt. We have about 70 million people on Medicaid. That's the system for poor people, and that's growing rapidly because of Obamacare. And, of course, we have all the public pensions outstanding. So we have made enormous pledges to the future that it may be impossible to fulfill given the slow-growing economy on top of the enormous debt we already have. So that it leaves us. What if we have a stock market crash or a recession? They've happened in the past, where the stock market goes down 30 or 40. One to think, how are we going to do in the past? It's probably going to happen again. And what happens to America when these things happen in the current circumstance of debt and slow growth and enormous promises? That's one of the things that leads me to believe that this period that started right after World War II, really with the birth of the baby boomers, is coming to an end as the baby boomers retire here in the next 10 or 15 years. So I kind of suggest in my book, I don't have a crystal ball, that over the next decade or so, the United States is going to be faced with an enormous crisis of its retirement systems and paying off the large amounts of debt that have accumulated and finding a way to make this economy grow more rapidly.
So again, we need to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about how some of this is beginning to divide up in states. You have the red square individuals that have more of a progressive or leftist kind of mindset, implement some of that almost as a social, and oftentimes the blue states are likewise. In some of the red states, you have, of course, more conservative ideas and how that's kind of morphed its way into almost a balkanization of America. And then while we're talking about that, I also want to, before we end this hour, to talk a little bit about what's happening in the area of higher education. That has certainly morphed as well. And we've in the past talked about things like the closing of the American mind and what is happening on the university campus. So we'll continue our discussion today with Dr. James Piereson. His book is entitled Shattered Consensus. We have information about him and his book on the website, pointofview.net. And as you go there, don't forget, some of you have yet to vote. I know many of you have, but if you're still one of those looking for more information, we have our Pray, Organize, and Vote. You may know who you're going to vote for president, but do you know who you're going to vote for maybe your state Supreme Court justice or your state legislature? Well, we have information there for you as well. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Dr. James Piereson with us today as we continue our conversation with him for a few more minutes about his book, Shattered Consensus. It's published by Encounter, 350 pages, just great material in here, and certainly fodder for some of the commentaries that I do, so certainly you can benefit from that. We have information about James Piereson as well as some information about him at the Manhattan Institute and the William E. Simon Foundation on our website, pointofview.net. But Jim, let's, if we can, talk about this idea of an inequality crisis. Of course, that's been in the news for some time. There have been some scholarly books, but even Bernie Sanders is talking about that. There may be an inequality crisis, but I'm fearing that the greatest crisis is going to have with the possible collapse of this entitlement state that you talk about in the book. That's where people that are totally dependent upon any kind of payment from the federal government one day won't see their checks come because, in a sense, the United States is bankrupt. What are your thoughts?
Well, Kerby, that's certainly a worry we have going out into the future. We've already said the economy is growing very slowly. The debt is very high. If we should have another recession or stock market collapse, it's going to be very difficult to pay the debts that we owe and to make good on the pledges that we've made, either to poor people or to students or to seniors and so on. So yes, that's a prospect that none of us wants to think about, but unfortunately, it could easily happen, given the situation we've gotten ourselves into.
So again, that's something to pay attention to, and it's really something to begin to ask candidates, whether for the presidency or whether to the United States Senate. We have 34 U.S. Senate races this year, 435 races, of course, for the House of Representatives, but also even asking whether or not your state legislators or your governors are dedicated to trying to get some kind of fiscal sanity. And that brings me to the other point I made just before I went to the break. That is the remarkable split in America. It's hard to have a consensus when you have the red states and the blue states. And in some respects, the blue states are right now dealing with one set of problems because they may have overpromised with certain kinds of welfare benefits, pension plans, or whatever. The red states a little bit different. But even the presidential campaign is really not about going to all 50 states to try to actually win that particular nomination. That is about going to some of those toss-up states like Iowa and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia, Colorado, Florida. And in some respects, that's another reason why we have this shattered consensus, don't you think?
Well, Kerby, I think it's very interesting that the country is divided up between these blue states and red states, with a handful of states in between, the so-called purple states. So, and as some have pointed out, the blue states follow a certain kind of economic model. They're high-tax states. They're somewhat driving businesses away. They're very strong union states. They're democratic states, as we've said, where public employees are very strong and probably the most powerful political force in those states. Then we have the red states. Those states tend to be lower tax states. They try to attract business. The union movement tends to be weaker there. Public employee unions are not quite as strong. And those states tend to lean Republican. A lot of those states are arrayed across the South and the Southwest and in the Great Plains. And, of course, the blue states are on the West Coast, the upper Midwest, and in the Northeast, New York and into New England. And in between, we have a handful of competitive states. Ohio would be one, probably. Iowa might be one. Colorado might be one. Maybe Florida's one these days. A few others, and that is where the presidential contest will be decided. Now, over the last 20 years or so, though, the Democratic Party in presidential elections have gotten somewhat the upper hand.
Sure.
I think someone has said there are about 16 states worth about 240 electoral votes that have gone Democratic, often comfortably so, for 6 straight elections going back to 1992. If that's the case, the Democrats start out with somewhere around 240 electoral votes in their pocket, and they only need to get to 270 to win the election. Republicans might start out with 125 or 150, and they have a somewhat harder slog ahead to get to 270. So that's somewhat where we are in our national politics. So the Republicans basically have to nominate someone who can win some of these competitive states: Ohio, Colorado, Iowa, maybe Wisconsin. And the Democrats just have to keep that base together and add a couple of states. And that's kind of the system that we've evolved. That could break apart at any time, depending upon who the parties nominate.
Might just mention, too, for those of you that get my daily commentary, my Thursday commentary is all about that, in which, if you look at that, I came up with 18 states as the District of Columbia, and that's all the New England states except New Hampshire. Then some of the eastern states like Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. A couple in the upper Midwest, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And then, of course, the West Coast states, which would be California, Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii. And if you start with that, Jim, in a sense, that means that if Hillary Clinton becomes the nominee, or Bernie Sanders or whoever, let's assume Hillary Clinton, she starts out basically with 242 electoral votes. You only need 270. And so unless you have a Republican candidate who can compete in one of those states, and that's something that people have talked about, is it possible that if, say, Donald Trump is nominated, whether he could compete in a New Jersey or a New York or something like that? If you cannot, you have to keep all of your other states, and then win almost all of those toss-up states. You almost have to run the table, which is kind of interesting, because if you look at the legislatures right now, you have many more Republican governors, many more Republican state legislatures. But when it comes to the presidency, that's the place where it almost seems to be pretty much of an advantage for the Democrats. So it's, again, another example of kind of a divided America and what you call sort of the shattered consensus that we have today.
Yes, and when someone like Barack Obama gets elected in that circumstance, he tries to ram through the kind of policies that are popular just in one half of the country. On the grounds, I won the election, we can do things my way. Of course, America really hasn't ever worked that way. The founding fathers set up a constitution which requires compromise and a certain amount of consensus before moving forward. But some of our politicians, President Obama included, don't seem to have that point of view. I was at a meeting with Governor Christie in November on the point you just made, and one of the questions we asked him was, was running for president, could you carry New Jersey, you're governor of New Jersey, could you carry New Jersey in a presidential contest against Hillary Clinton? And he said, no, I don't think so.
Isn't that amazing?
So he said, I might make her work for it, but I don't think in this day and age that a Republican can carry the state of New Jersey. So, that kind of tells us where we are. So from the Republican point of view, they need to nominate someone who can run well in these competitive states. It's not clear how this is going to come out.
Well, and again, just think back over some of the other presidents. I mean, you assumed that Ronald Reagan was going to win California. Of course, he won a lot more than that. You assumed that Bill Clinton was going to win Arkansas, that George W. Bush was going to win Texas. Those were all the assumptions you would make. Of course, you didn't have Al Gore win his own home state of Tennessee, but this is just kind of a new environment where the governor of New Jersey doesn't think he's going to win New Jersey. Or if John Kasich was the VP nominee with Donald Trump, no necessarily guarantee that he would win Ohio, although I think that would be the hope. So it just shows you that we're kind of in this new era that you talk about in your book. When we come back, I did want to spend just a minute or two, if we could, before we run out of time, talking about education, because your closing chapters there are something else we've talked about here on Point of View, what has happened in the academy and how that has changed remarkably, and how what we should do is also pay attention to that. And of course, you've sort of alluded to that when we were already talking about the indebtedness of students in terms of going to the university, as well as certainly the issue of safe spaces and the issue of political correctness, multiculturalism, postmodernism. So we're going to get into some of that as well. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about Dr. James Piereson, you can certainly go to our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you'll see that we have some links, and one of those is to the Manhattan Institute, where you can find out more about him. Also, of course, find out more by going to the William E. Simon Foundation. And most importantly, the book, published by Encounter Books, is one that I think you will probably find in your local bookstore. But if not, we've made it very easy for you to order it online, and you can either get it in hardcover or Kindle and read it and learn a little bit more about some of these changes that are taking place in our society. So often we talk about trends, and this is another very important trend that is happening almost regardless of what happens in the political campaigns this year. We are, in a sense, coming to the end of a very significant era, and that may be leading to a fourth revolution. And what does that mean for America? What does it mean for you? What does it mean in the future? We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. James Piereson as we talk about his book, Shattered Consensus. Second hour, we're going to get back into the political arena, and we're certainly going to spend some time talking about how will Donald Trump do tonight and what will happen in these debates. First, a Democratic debate tomorrow night, then the next night, a Republican debate. We'll be, of course, covering that all through the week. And, of course, there are some questions as to whether or not Marco Rubio will step down. Also, is it possible that Ted Cruz can win something else in the future, or is it a foregone conclusion that Donald Trump will be the nominee? And in the news right now, of course, Iran talking about walking away from its Iranian deal. We've talked about that on the program. So we have a lot to cover in the second hour. Of course, we'll open up the phones to give you a chance to join our conversation. But I did want, for just a few minutes, Jim, to talk about what you call the left university. You know, in the 1950s, sometimes it was possible that if an individual were a member of the Communist Party, that would disqualify them from actually teaching in a university. Today, that wouldn't be a problem. I think the one disqualifier that might keep a person from getting tenure is if they were registered in the Republican Party. And you know as well as I do that when you look at some of these various faculty and they ask, you know, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, it's definitely, as you describe in your book, a left-leaning university, isn't it?
Well, Kerby, there's no question that over the last 30, 40 years, the American university has been taken over by the political left, and it's evolved really into a base for the Democratic Party to a large degree. Because, as you say, they do not welcome Republicans on the campus, even as lecturers. There are very few conservative or Republican faculty in any field. I think it'd be very difficult to name any president of any major university who's a Republican. You know, they're all basically liberal Democrats. So in all the disciplines, at least the political disciplines, social science disciplines, all lean to the left. So it's very discouraging and disappointing what has happened, but as I say in my book, this is an element of the polarization that we've been talking about. Basically, the American university has joined the left nation. They lean Democratic, lean left-wing, and they protect that base for the American left.
Well, and again, as you point out, just in passing, it's worth mentioning just for a second that it isn't just that you are not allowed to be a professor on the campus, but you document something we've talked about on this program before, that Dr. Ben Carson, who's been on this program with us many times, had to withdraw his commencement speech at his own home university, where he was a pediatric neurobiologist at Johns Hopkins University. Condoleezza Rice forced to withdraw from Rutgers. You can go all the way down the list of individuals that were not even allowed to give a lecture, one lecture on the campus. So it isn't just that it's sort of left-leaning. It is, in a way, preventing even the opportunity for another viewpoint to be expressed in the university. And that is something that is far beyond anything we've ever really seen in modern times, isn't it?
Well, it's a disgraceful situation, and it's certainly a betrayal of all of the ideals of higher education. A lot of students have gone to the point of saying that if they hear a point of view that they disagree with, that it hurts their feelings.
Yes.
That they've begun to feel unsafe and threatened, and therefore no one is allowed to speak a disagreeable point of view for fear of hurting their feelings. This is something that's completely new. I would have never guessed that things would have descended this far. I'll tell a personal story. I was on the Yale University campus last November to participate in a conference on free speech on the campus that had been organized about 6 months before. And it occurred on the same weekend that, you know, another controversy erupted on the campus over Halloween costumes.
And we're all familiar with that because I've written about that and we've talked about it. Go ahead.
So in the midst of our conference on free speech on campus, a bunch of students disrupted our meeting. People were speaking about the need for free speech and respectful debate, and the students broke up our conference. So I thought it was very ironic that a conference on free speech on campus should be broken up by students. Now, the worst part of this was that within a week, the president of Yale University devoted $50 million of the endowment of the university to support the programs demanded by these students.
Well, and again, as a graduate of Yale, I haven't been sending any of my money to the Alumni Foundation for that either.
I wouldn't advise it. But I would say on this whole problem, now I wouldn't tar all students with this brush, because a lot of students go off to campus. Some are moderate, conservatives, liberals, whatever, of both parties. They come from various kinds of homes and neighborhoods. They're not highly political. They might have some beliefs. But when they land on the campus, there is an industry on campus called the diversity industry.
Yes.
And there's always a feminist center, there's a multicultural center, there's a race center, there's a third world center, all with administrators. Some of them teach some courses, and they gather committed students around them, and they proselytize. And one of the things that most of these campus controversies erupt out of these centers that they've erected on campus. And I find that whenever one of these things happens and they get around to making a list of demands, one of the things they always want is more money for their centers. So from a cynical point of view, a lot of these uprisings are based upon demands for more resources by these political groups that colleges have erected on campus. So, my hope would be that we begin to get rid of these things, not devote more resources to them, because they divide the campus into different groups, ethnic groups, racial groups, gender groups, and so on, and proselytize around them.
Well, again, this is a book that I certainly commend to you to read and learn a little bit more about. It is published by Encounter Books, Shattered Consensus, The Rise and Decline of America's Postwar Political Order. And even though we've been somewhat pessimistic, I noticed, Jim, that you don't counsel at the end of the book for us to buy guns, gold, and move to Wisconsin or Wyoming or Montana or Alaska or something like that. You believe there's some really great opportunities for us in the midst of this, but at the same time, you give us a very good look at the fact that we may be coming to the end of the third revolution and heading to a fourth revolution. And in some respects, as you look at even what's happening in the political arena, I see some wisdom in that analysis. So thank you for giving us some time today. Thank you for writing the book, and let's do it again sometime.
Appreciate it very much, Kerby. Thank you.
Again, the book is entitled Shattered Consensus, The Rise and Decline of America's Postwar Political Order. If you'd like to know a little bit more about him, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, click on the button that says See More. That will take you, for example, to the Manhattan Institute. You can find that information there and, of course, find some of the links to some of the other material that he has been writing, and you will find that to be very helpful. And, of course, if you'd like to correspond with him with your comments or questions, that would certainly be the case. Let me mention, too, that we still are encouraging you to follow up on the Equality Act. That's our action item for today. And also my Viewpoints commentary on constitutional interpretation. How was the Constitution established? How are we supposed to read it? And how has the loss of Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court maybe challenged that in the future, and maybe illustrated why this next appointment to the Supreme Court is going to be so important? That's why it's important to pay attention to the political arena, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this second hour today. This is a very important day for those of you in Michigan and in Mississippi, as well as in Idaho and Hawaii. Then a little bit later, of course, the Virgin Islands, Guam, and the District of Columbia will vote. But in addition to this, a week from today, which will be another kind of major Super Tuesday, March 15th, will be Florida, Illinois, Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio, to mention just a few. Very important states. So we'll come back and talk about what all that means right after these messages.
From Focus Features, in association with Motive Entertainment, comes The Young Messiah.
You seek a family from Nazareth with a boy named Jesus.
The Young Messiah imagines the journey of Jesus with his family from Egypt to Nazareth and on to Jerusalem, where his identity is revealed and his destiny fulfilled.
He's just a child.
He is not just a child.
In theaters March 11th. Rated PG-13, may not be appropriate for children under 13. More information at youngmessiahresources.com. Are you concerned about what's happening in our colleges, our marketplace, and the halls of government? Let me ask, have you invested in things that yield a good harvest? If you're already giving to Point of View each month, we thank you. You share in the reward for what we harvest. If you're not, now is the time. $30, $65, $100. The more you invest on a regular basis, the more we'll reap together. Give online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Click at the top on Become a Monthly Partner or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, we're going to spend some time talking about campaign 2016, election 2016. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's open up the phones. Especially love to hear from some of you, say, in Michigan. You have a chance to vote today. Those of you in Mississippi, of course, you get a chance to vote. Hawaii, Iowa, 149 delegates at stake today and tonight. We'll spend some more time tomorrow talking about what that means. And we'll talk about whether or not this begins to make it inevitable that Donald Trump will be the nominee. He really hopes to win at least Michigan. Now, recognize that these four particular cases tonight, each one of these primaries are proportional. Next Tuesday, they're all on the other side. They're all winner take all. Now, there's a few that are proportional, things like Marianas and things like that. But most of these are winner take all. Some of them are not. But a large percentage of them are. North Carolina would be the only exception next week. And so that's where you really begin to rack them up. But again, even if Donald Trump wins all four, and even if they're all proportional, okay, he doesn't win 149, but let's say he wins maybe 70 of those, and maybe Ted Cruz wins 50, and I'm not sure that happens, but let's just be as optimistic as you could for those two candidates, and we'll see how they split out. They could be a little different. That already gives him 20 more lead ahead of Ted Cruz, in which he already has a significant lead. So these are some important things to pay attention to, and certainly one of the reasons why there are those attempts to try to stop Donald Trump. I'm going to talk more about that in just a minute, because you've seen this in a couple of different venues. First of all, one which was the World Forum, which was held by the American Enterprise Institute, which was kind of a who's who of individuals that gathered together in Georgia, and are now willing to spend millions of dollars. I mean, some are talking about $50 million, others saying $25 million. It doesn't even matter when you get into that level of anti-Trump ads in Florida, so that he does not come away with all 99 delegates in Florida. But as you start paying attention to some of this, you have to at least recognize that if these polls mean anything, and sometimes they can be a little bit off, let's just take a couple of those states next week, which are going to be even more important than the ones today. 149 delegates at stake today, 358 in the states, and I'm not counting things like North Marianas and American Samoa and some others that will also be happening that day. And so you look at Florida, and you can see that Trump is ahead, at least at the moment, according to some of the polls. The Bay News 9, News 13 poll has him up by 20 points over Marco Rubio. Is Marco Rubio going to overtake him in Florida? I doubt it. And of course, by the way, I will mention as we go along, the Democrats and Hillary Clinton up 31 points in that Florida poll. Let's go to Illinois. We have listeners in Illinois as well. And in this particular case, Donald Trump up at least 10 points over Ted Cruz. Is it possible that Ted Cruz could come back and win Illinois? Well, that would be really significant for him, because then he would get those 69 delegates. It's, again, a winner-take-all. When you get to Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, she's up by 42 points. So, again, that one is over. It's been over for some time, actually, for Bernie Sanders, but just thought I would mention that. And then let's go to Ohio. We have a lot of listeners in Ohio. And, again, there are 66 delegates up for grabs and up for that particular one. This is the only place where you see a another candidate competitive. Donald Trump's up 3 points over John Kasich using the PPP poll. And of course, though, some of those could change. So it's possible that John Kasich could win his own state. But again, by contrast, just to show you, Hillary Clinton up 21 points over Bernie Sanders. So this is where you find yourself right now. So there was some enthusiasm after Super Tuesday and even after Super Saturday, in which, for example, Daniel Horowitz said that Cruz is surging. And certainly Ted Cruz has been talking about the fact that he has been able to beat Donald Trump in a crowded field and would be able to beat him even better in an uncrowded field, certainly because of some of the victories that he had over the weekend. So those were certainly helpful to Ted Cruz. At the same time, we recognize that some of these other candidates are providing sort of a spoiler situation, because if John Kasich and Marco Rubio had been out of the race, then Ted Cruz would have won Kentucky, which he did not. Donald Trump ended up doing that and siphoning off some of the conservative base. There are many that have said that after Saturday, and now even looking ahead to not being able to win his own home state in Florida, maybe it's possible that Marco Rubio will drop out. He failed to win 20% in a single state on Saturday. And if it weren't for sort of that last moment opportunity that came his way because of Puerto Rico, he did pick up 23 more delegates. But let's recognize he has 151. And when you need 1237, you are a very, very far way away from that. And so in some respects, what's happening is John Kasich is starting to supplant Marco Rubio as the candidate of choice for some of the moderate Republicans. So it is possible that he could win Ohio. But if you look at the numbers for Florida, he's still very far behind, and so that is not going to be a state he's going to pick up. If you look at Illinois, he's also very far behind, so even though he may win his home state of Ohio and pick up those 66 delegates, it won't really do much more than add 66 to his 37 and put him over 100 as well. The other point that I made, and I thought I would make it again, is that if it hadn't been for early voting, Ted Cruz would have done a lot better, because some of his surge on Tuesday, at Super Tuesday, had already taken place, but after many people had already voted. And when you look at the early voting, and I'll pick Louisiana as an example from Saturday, Donald Trump actually beat Ted Cruz 2-1 in early voting, yet Cruz himself won the election day voting. And so that shows why sometimes these ideas of early voting are somewhat harmful, because individuals who vote early might vote for a candidate, say like Jeb Bush, Ben Carson, or somebody who has not done well until that point. And then all of a sudden they catch fire. That early voting certainly harmed Ted Cruz. Imagine if you had not had the other candidates in the race and you did not have early voting. It is at least theoretically possible that then he would have actually won not just Kansas and Maine, but Kentucky, Louisiana, perhaps even Puerto Rico. And that would have been a sweep for Ted Cruz last Saturday, but of course did not take place. So those are some important issues. But let me take a break, and when we come back, give you a chance to join your conversation and maybe share a couple of your insights. Perhaps you voted today. I'd love to know who you voted for. Want to also get into this issue if indeed Donald Trump is the nominee. Brett Baer last night, who was doing a town hall with Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, also pointed out that he's meeting more and more Republicans in Washington who are privately saying they would actually back Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump. And, of course, this group that is gathered together, putting together millions of dollars to actually put these anti-Trump ads in Florida. So we'll see where that plays out. And, of course, that brings us, of course, also to the question of a contested convention. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The current vacancy on the Supreme Court highlights the ongoing debate about how to properly interpret the Constitution. The late Justice Antonin Scalia wanted the High Court to interpret the Constitution the original way the founders intended. An originalist would argue that words have a distinct meaning and are written to convey that meaning to any generation. Likewise, the Constitution was written to communicate a particular meaning yesterday, and that still applies today and will apply in the future. An originalist recognizes that some circumstances have changed since the drafting of the Constitution. For example, our modes of travel are different. But the goal is still to understand the original intent of the framers and apply those foundational principles to the contemporary situation. Apparently, the founders of this country and the framers of the Constitution were concerned that we might drift from these principles due to incremental changes. James Madison is considered the architect of the Constitution. He warned, "I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpation." In the middle of the 20th century, there were many who began to describe the Constitution as a living and breathing document. Chief Justice Earl Warren proposed that the Constitution should be interpreted in light of the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. Associate Justice Thurgood Marshall was even more explicit when he acknowledged, "You do what you think is right and let the law catch up." So the framers were concerned that future justices would not adhere to constitutional principles. That's why the U.S. Senate should also be concerned. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Focus Features and Motive Entertainment present The Young Messiah, a story of Jesus as a youth, in theaters March 11th, rated PG-13. YoungMessiahResources.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. One of the questions on the table is, would you actually vote for Donald Trump? It is intriguing to see the number of people lining up saying that they would not vote for him, and now the piece that I just read, and let me get into it in a little more detail, from Brett Baer, saying that actually some said, not only would I not vote for Donald Trump, I would actually vote for Hillary Clinton. That one really kind of surprised me. It's one thing to say, I just couldn't bring myself to vote for Donald Trump if he is the Republican nominee. But it's another thing to be a Republican, even a Republican leader, one of the establishment, and say, as a matter of fact, I think I might even vote for Hillary Clinton instead. And this is exactly what they told Fox News anchor Brett Baer. He was being interviewed the other day because, after all, on Monday, he did a Democratic town hall with Hillary Clinton, which, by the way, is the first appearance she's had on the network in 2 years. And then Bernie Sanders is the first time he's ever been on with Brett Baer. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well. But in the midst of that, he said, listen, there are Republicans in Washington who are privately saying that already they are not going to vote for Donald Trump, and some of them are even saying that they would actually vote for Hillary Clinton. He says maybe some don't publicly say it, but I think there are some who are adamant that they would. And, of course, this is part of what he says. Now, Brett Baer went on to say, obviously, the Never Trump movement is trying to stop that from happening and trying to prevent him from getting to 1,237, the number of delegates needed. But short of that and some sort of Hail Mary at the Cleveland convention, there are definitely Republicans who are looking at that. He says, I think that in the Republican Party, it is unifying force that if Hillary Clinton is the nominee, to find a Republican who can win. And so far, the Trump nomination seems to be steaming along. So that is certainly the case. Now, I might just point out that the article I've posted here today by John Funn says at the current rate, Donald Trump might not get 1,237 delegates. And he says if it takes from, this is the issue about Donald Trump, if it takes from candidates who have left the race, such as Ben Carson, then Donald Trump is on track to win. If he is declining, he is unlikely to enter the Cleveland Convention with the 1,237 delegates needed to win, because many of the delegates bound to win on the first ballot aren't personal supporters and will probably abandon him. Trump could cut a deal with delegates of, say, John Kasich, who I just mentioned, who has been noticeably reluctant to criticize Trump, even in the midst of some of the controversy. So that's one idea, and that's one of the arguments people have been making, why, indeed, John Kasich stays in the race. Winning Ohio, as I point out, gives him 66 delegates, winner take all, but he's not going to actually become the nominee, but he could become the the vice presidential nominee and be the, if you will, the firewall to the Democratic attempt to get Ohio. The assumption there is that the governor of Ohio would then put Ohio in play, and during the election you need 270 electoral votes, and Ohio becomes very, very important because Ohio are those 18 electoral votes in a swing state. There has never been, in modern times, a Republican who has won the presidency who has not won the state of Ohio. Let's, if we can, and I'll take some phone calls here, deal with a couple of issues. Starting on March 15th, John Funn says, the first states to allocate delegates on a winner-take-all basis start voting. And, of course, one of those is Ohio with John Kasich. The other is Florida, which in the past some people would have thought that Marco Rubio would win. Now, John Funn concludes that if Trump wins both Ohio and Florida, then he will have half the delegates needed to clinch the Republican nomination. He would then only have to win just over 50% of the delegates selected after March 15th to reach the magic delegate number of 1,237. So winning next week in Ohio and Florida make it even more likely that Donald Trump is the nominee. But on the other hand, what if, and this is the what if, Trump loses Florida, but let's take it the other way. Let's say he wins Florida but loses Ohio, and Ohio goes to John Kasich, which is at least a possibility. Then he'd have to win 57% of the remaining delegates. But if he does lose both Florida and Ohio, then that would mean that Trump would have to then get 66% of the remaining delegates to reach the 1,237. That may be a few too many numbers to mention on the air, but the point is that the difference between having to get half the delegates and 2/3 of the delegates is very, very significant. And it is less likely that Donald Trump could get 2/3 of the delegates, given the fact that Ted Cruz has been doing okay in those places which have been proportional and which have been closed primaries. And you have many more of those primaries coming up. But, of course, March 15th, you have the winner-take-all primaries, and so those are some very significant ones indeed. Just one more thing before I get to the phone calls, and that is, I mentioned before, these super PAC ads that are going to be anti-Trump ads from the super PAC. For those of you in Florida, maybe you can begin next week sharing with us some of those that are surfacing here. Some of those are robocalls. And by the way, Mitt Romney has been doing robocalls on behalf of Marco Rubio. Some of them are television ads, and some of them are social media. But again, it looks like those of you in Florida, my condolences to you ahead of time. You're going to get pummeled with ads like you've never seen before, because these individuals that gathered together wanted to stop Donald Trump. And it was an interesting collection of individuals at this World Forum in Georgia. It's put on every year by the American Enterprise Institute. And by the way, we've had some different guests from the American Enterprise Institute, including the president, who is a conservative. But also this was one where they drew a lot of people that would be very easily referred to as liberals or progressives. I was amazed how many of them come from like Silicon Valley and how many come from kind of the high-tech industry, because some of the people that were there, and one of the things they were talking about was, of course, an anti-Trump focus, and really even as one person, Bill Kristol of Weekly Standard said, kind of the specter of Donald Trump. You had people like the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook. You had the co-founder of Google, Larry Page. You had the individual that is known for his cars and for his space focus, Elon Musk, and all sorts of others that were there trying to come up with some way to stop Donald Trump. And so you are seeing an interesting, if you will, alliance of those who would be considered conservatives and those who would be considered progressives gathering together, trying to see if there is a way that indeed they could stop Donald Trump from getting the 1,237 delegates that are necessary. Let's take some phone calls and get some of your comments. Justin in Georgia on the Good News Network, what would you like to add to the conversation today?
Hey, thanks for having me. I think Ted Cruz should win.
Why so?
I think because he's the most Christian out of all the group, and he's firm on what he thinks is right in the Bible about Planned Parenthood and gay marriage and things, and he doesn't criticize people like Donald Trump does, and I think he's just the best, and he's not Catholic, so when it comes to Catholic things, I think he'd be firm on that too.
Well, interesting enough, in Georgia, Donald Trump won. He got 40 delegates, and Ted Cruz only got 18. But that's a good example of if Marco Rubio were not there. You got to believe that the 14 delegates that end up going to Marco Rubio in Georgia might have gone. It's a big guess, but at least is a possibility that he might have gone. They might have gone to Ted Cruz, and in that case, he might have won. So we'll see how that plays out. So if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. When we come back, I'll also talk about what would be the response if indeed that were the case, that Donald Trump were not put in nomination and did not receive the nomination at the convention. And he was on Morning Joe with Joe Scarborough, and so I'll read a little bit of what he had to say there, as well as some other comments that have been made by the editors of National Review. Quite a number of people making comments about the possibility of Donald Trump being the nominee and what they might do. But I'd like to get your comments. Are you ready to say that even if Donald Trump is the nominee, you would vote for him? Or would that be enough for you to say, as some are now starting to say, nope, I think I would vote for Hillary Clinton? And so would love to get your thoughts about that. We'll have a chance to hear from what Donald Trump said to Joe Scarborough, as well as what the editors of National Review said about this particular race and how some of this might play out. And so if you'd like to join the conversation and express your opinion, we'll give you that opportunity. 1-800-351-1212. I know many of you that are in the listening audience have already voted. Some of you have not. So let me certainly encourage you to go to our Pray, Organize, and Vote election resource. Great resources there for you, not only so that you know more about the presidential candidates, which is primarily our focus on a national radio program, but we have information there that will help you know a little bit more about certain state legislators and judges and others, and ways in which you can find that information, even if it's not posted there, because we want you to make an informed decision when you go into the polls and vote. Let's take a break. We'll come back with some of your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. Love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. All the lines are full, so as a caller drops off, you can certainly join our conversation. Let me just give you a program note. Tomorrow, we're going to spend the first hour kind of looking back over this Tuesday set of elections and looking ahead to what that might mean in terms of the delegate count. Second hour, we're going to have the director and screenwriter for the new movie, The Young Messiah. If you enjoyed Risen, which was a historical fiction that, in a sense, tells the story from the eyes of a Roman tribune of the resurrection of Jesus, this one tells the story of what would it be like to have a young Jesus, as you have some very important biblical plot points. Of course, his birth in Bethlehem, going to Egypt, then also being in Nazareth and coming to Jerusalem at the age of 12, and then again, historical fiction behind it. And so we'll be talking about that. And then we'll have Lewis Hogan with the founder of DC Cry and Rick Curry, a pastor. And the last part there talking about the importance of praying for our nation. So that's what tomorrow will bring. In just a minute, I'll take some of your phone calls, but I thought I'd just mention that today Donald Trump was on with Scarborough, and Morning Joe was talking about, are you going to be able to make your peace with an establishment that's against you? And first Donald Trump said, I've had feuds, I've had fights with people, I've been able to get along. But he really went back to the fact that the biggest story to politics right now are the number of people showing up in the primaries. He said 4 years ago, some of the Republicans were kind of dying, although I don't necessarily completely agree with that, but they're now energized. Talks about running into all sorts of people saying, I've never voted before, but I'm going to vote for you, or I did vote for you. These are independents and Democrats as well as Republicans that are voting. And so he says, it's the biggest story in politics, what's happening with the Republicans. I've done a great job, and I'm not being given credit. Instead, they're taking out ads against me, and I talked about those ads. And, of course, a week ago, he was also saying that millions have joined me, but the establishment wants to throw that right out the window, because if I get out, those people are coming with me. He may be true about that. And National Review said that we have a possibility of a contested convention. The best way, they say, to defeat Donald Trump is for someone to beat him outright and earn a majority of the delegates. But even with Ted Cruz's surge in the Super Saturday contest over the weekend, that seems unlikely. And so they say that the only possibility they see right now is that no one shows up at the convention with 1,237 votes. And so the role of the convention then would be to secure the party nominee. But, of course, if they did that, all the people that supported Donald Trump would say, what about us? So, again, they said provided a deal is not struck prior to the first vote, delegates would be free to negotiate that end towards the initial vote, and a majority would have to eventually come up with a candidate. But, of course, they also point out that if Trump rolls through the winner-take-all states next Tuesday, it will all be academic, and the conjecture will be dramatic for another reason, that is the spectacle of a badly fractured party hitching its fortunes to a badly flawed nominee. That's at least the answer from the National Review. So I'd love to know about your comments, and we've mentioned also Brett Baer talking about running into people who are Republican establishment people saying not only would they not vote for Donald Trump, they would actually cross over and vote for Hillary Clinton. What are your thoughts about that? Let's go to the phones. 1-800-351-1212. First in Kentucky, WYGE. George, thanks for calling today.
Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm glad you called.
Yes. For somebody to jump over to a lawless party and vote for a lawbreaker, I really can't understand that. And, but our party, the Republican Party, is acting just about like the way the Democrats are acting. I mean, Hillary Clinton lost to Bernie Sanders in one state, but yet she wins the delegates.
Yeah.
The super delegates, and that's so flawed. And
for my Democrats out there, you should be asking your party leaders why they're allowed to do that. Yes, there are a few super delegates in the Republican Party, but the few that are there, and it's a very small number compared to the Democrats, they're supposed to at least vote with their state. But you have all sorts of Democrats in these super delegates that can do anything you want. And you think you have a Republican establishment. I can't even believe what the Democratic establishment has been able to pull off really ever since 1984.
Oh, I know. And ever since I've been voting, which I'm 65 years old now, and ever since I've been voting, I started when I was 18, the Republican Party stood behind their candidate no matter, it was the will of the people. Whoever the people put up there, that's who they stood for as long as I can remember.
Sure.
And for them to be pulling these shenanigans now like they're doing, I'm about to denounce being a Republican. It just makes me sick.
Well, I did a little bit in the first hour here with James Piereson, and we've had some others on here. One of the others, and I can't think of his name right at the moment, even suggested that we may just have new parties. I mean, there was a time when there was no Republican Party. It was the Whig Party, but it just went the way of the dinosaur or the dodo bird or whatever. And I think that's at least a possibility in light of some of these trends that we're seeing. So, George, I appreciate your comments. I want to give as many callers a chance, so I'm going to kind of move through these calls fairly quickly. We'll go to Georgia on the Good News Network. Ray, what would you like to add to the conversation today?
Oh, I'd just like to say, all these people that's talking about they'd vote for Hillary over Trump, they claim to be a Republican. First off, let me say I'm a Christian. Second off, let me say I'm a veteran. And
thank you for your service.
You're welcome. But the reason I mentioned that is I got a lot of brothers and sisters that never came home.
Yes.
And then you look at Benghazi. That woman needs to be in prison, not president. And anybody that claims, well, instead of voting for the one that the people has picked, will vote for this criminal, I look at them just like, they get on there and say, well, Donald Trump ain't a Christian. Neither was Obama, but yet they voted for him. I got kinfolk that did that. Okay. But then I read the Bible, and I don't see America in the Bible nowhere.
Well, that's true. Yes.
We're gonna change, but this has become a circus. These people are supposed to be educated people, but they act like kindergartners. So I really don't know what I want to say other than if you want to vote for Hillary, you just want to continue the destruction of this country that Obama has got going. That's all I got to say.
Appreciate your phone call. Again, thank you for your service. Let's get another phone call real quickly if we can, just before we take one of our mandatory breaks. And Kenny, I think you have some comments about some of those Republican leaders.
Yes, sir. Pretty much more of the same as what I've been hearing from the previous callers. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Yeah, it's just Hillary shouldn't even be a nominee for presidential election. She should be in prison. And for a Republican leader to say, well, I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump and I'd rather vote for Hillary, I mean, to me, that just wraps up our entire government in a nutshell. Thanks for taking my call, Kerby.
Well, thank you. Let me just mention that those of you that actually have a chance to read or hear my commentary, one that's coming out next week that I'm taping, has to do with why I think it's really important for the FBI to come down with their actions. And that is, if the FBI is going to actually recommend that an indictment be brought against Hillary Clinton, I think that's only fair, first of all, for those of you listening that are Democrats to know whether or not you are going to be voting for a candidate that will be indicted, because I think that might change your mind on those things. I think it's important before the convention that takes place in Philadelphia for you to know, because you might say, we need to come up with somebody other than Hillary Clinton to run for the presidency, maybe Joe Biden or maybe Bernie Sanders, whatever that might be. And so we have some real important questions swirling around Hillary Clinton. And this is not over Benghazi, which was the conversation that we had just a minute ago with Ray, but the issue of the emails and the email scandal, which has become so significant. And frankly, as I've mentioned in some of my previous commentaries and even on the air, other people have been indicted for much less. So it seems to me that that should be the case. Now, if indeed the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, does not follow the recommendations of the FBI Director, James Comey, Well, then at least we know what's happening there. And that's a possibility, because then I've thought in the past that probably James Comey, the FBI director, would resign, because those of us that are older might remember when you had the Watergate scandal and some of those individuals refused to carry out Richard Nixon's order. You had Elliot Richardson and William Ruckershaus resign. But now people that know James Comey said, no, he wouldn't resign. He's been wanting to be FBI director all of his life. So instead, he might release all sorts of incriminating information that should have led to an indictment, and that could have a negative influence on the campaign. So my argument is that I think it's time for the FBI to do something. As some of you Southerners like to say, it's time to fish or cut bait, right? You know, it's time to get out and do something, because the FBI, in some respects, is holding over the head of Hillary Clinton. And that, of course, could change everything in even the primaries taking place tonight, because I haven't spent too much time talking about it, but everybody believes that Hillary Clinton will win all 4 of those states. But would she if she were indicted? How would that affect Bernie Sanders? Those are good questions. We'll take a few more calls right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Terrell next. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
I'm in agreement with the other people. You know, the thought of voting for Hillary is so egregious to me. I can't imagine anybody even making that threat. The situation with us, my son just became an Eagle Scout, and his whole lifelong dream has been to be a Navy SEAL. And with the way Hillary was so flippant about sending these Navy SEALs to their death in Benghazi, I told my son, I said, if she becomes president, there's no way I'm going to agree to let you become a Navy SEAL.
Wow.
It'll be your decision. But, I'm going to tell you, please don't, because I wouldn't want you to be serving a commander-in-chief that doesn't value your life. And he is as serious about it. He's studying foreign languages. He's wanting to study mixed martial arts so that he goes into the SEAL program already ready. He's really serious about it. But it just scares me the way that she was so flippant about, the lives of these Navy SEALs.
That's why we need to get the right commander-in-chief, because, as you know, we've had some Navy SEALs on our program, some Rangers and others, and it's a great calling. First of all, congratulations for being an Eagle Scout. What a great, when I said before, if I look down a resume and see Eagle Scout, I don't need to call any of the references. Somebody's been able to achieve that already has achieved a great deal. And of course, we've had individuals talking about the scouting, everything from the former governor of the state of Texas, Rick Perry, who was an Eagle Scout, to all sorts of other individuals. So congratulations to him, and thank you so very much for reminding us of why it's important to pay attention to who the commander-in-chief might be.
Absolutely. Have a blessed day.
Well, thank you for calling in, and we'll see if we can get in a few more phone calls real quickly. So let's head to Texas this time. KJRT. Christy, what would you like to share with us from God's Word?
Hey, Kirby.
Yes.
I've been looking through the scriptures with regard to the presidential election, and, God really has a lot of stuff in there for us. And when in 1 Samuel, David goes to Saul, and he says to Saul, he said, your servant was watching his father's sheep, and a lion and a bear came, and I slew both of them, and the same Lord that helped me to slay them is going to help me to slay this giant. And I can think of only one person, I'm not going to mention any names, but I can think of only one person who has gone in and fought with the lion and the bear, and who really, truly is trusting the Lord in a lot of respects. Now, the flip side of the coin is, when we talk about Mr. Trump, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul writes, and he says to the Corinthian church, he said, I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother, okay, and he identifies himself as being a Presbyterian, although I will qualify that by saying that just because you go into the garage does not make you a car. But anyway, he says, if anyone who calls himself a brother is immoral, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, drunkard, swindler, not even to eat with such a one. So I think that tells us very plainly that if that's the kind of person that you're looking at, God doesn't even want you to associate with them, let alone vote them in to be president of the United States.
Well, you've got some good verses there. And again, I've said before that people say, well, there's not a lot about politics in the Bible. Which Bible are you reading? I mean, we're talking about kings and emperors, and we're talking about individuals that served in government like Daniel, others that were leaders themselves, others who were Roman citizens like Paul, and you have so many biblical principles that I think you can derive from Scripture. And you have to be careful not to recognize that, obviously, when we're talking about the Old Testament, it's an Old Testament theocracy, and you want to always apply all those to the New Testament church. But if you can use some reasonable common sense hermeneutics, you can come up with all sorts of biblical principles. So, Christy, I appreciate you taking us through Scriptures real quickly today on that.
And I just want to say that as far as Hillary goes, not a chance, not after Benghazi. She showed exactly what her true colors were when she walked away and just said, well, it's done and over with. Not for the families of the people who lost family members.
Well said.
Not hardly, so, yeah, Hillary's not even an option.
Let me take another phone call real quickly, just almost out of time here, and I want to give as many of you a chance to express your opinion. You'll have a lot more tomorrow time after we have the primaries that will unfold tonight in Hawaii, Idaho, Michigan, and Mississippi. But let's go to Arizona, KNLB. Richard, I think you wanted to talk about Hillary Clinton, so you have the floor.
Yeah, Kirby, your comment about your article coming out next week.
really rang loud. Our not local congressman, our U.S. congressman visited us this morning, and his prediction was that in about 2, maybe 3 weeks, you're going to see Hillary indicted. He said that there's no way that immunity would have been given to her IT guy unless there was a assurance that they could nail her. And it's not going to only be the Mrs. Clinton. Mr. is also facing some possible charges there.
And her assistant Huma could be as well. Yes, I mean, I do believe this. And again, I say to my Democratic listeners out here, wouldn't you like to know that? Because after all, you're trying to decide between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. But maybe you end up at your convention with a contested convention. We've been talking about a possible contested convention for the Republicans in Cleveland. What about the convention in Philadelphia in July for the Democrats? I mean, that could be a contested convention where they bring in, I don't know, Joe Biden or something. I don't know.
Well, the talk in Washington, D.C., apparently, is that Joe Biden with Elizabeth Warren as his running mate are going to be possibly the chosen ones, although Andrew Cuomo is beating the bush all in the Washington, D.C. area, making his face known to those that he's interested in the vice presidency as well.
Yes.
So it could be very interesting coming up
I think so.
In a few weeks.
This is why I would encourage everybody to pay attention to point of view. One other talk show host said, the talk show gods have certainly smiled well upon our fortunes, and I wouldn't say it that way, but I thought it was an interesting way of saying that we always have something to talk about, and these next couple of weeks could get real interesting real fast. We have never had a contested convention in our modern times. I mean, you got to go back really to 1948 to get anything that looks like a contested convention. Although, of course, you could say 68, but or 76 for the Republicans, but I don't really think so. And so that alone is something. And of course, with the possible indictment of Hillary Clinton and what that might mean for the Democratic Party, of course, what is happening in the Republican Party and the anti-Trump ads through these super PACs in Florida, we've got a lot to cover. We will have to do that tomorrow because we are out of time. Those of you online, it's not like I don't like you. We just ran out of time before we ran out of opportunities to call on you. So you can have the opportunity tomorrow, and we'll give you that opportunity. We will be watching, of course, what is going to happen tonight in Michigan and Michigan and Mississippi. Keep trying to put Minnesota in there. That's coming up in the future there. Michigan and Mississippi, Idaho and Hawaii. Then there will be some smaller ones over the next couple of days, the Virgin Islands, Guam, District of Columbia, and then next Tuesday, a week from today, we will have another Super Tuesday, and that's Florida, Illinois, Missouri, North Carolina, Ohio. And those of you listeners in those states, we certainly want to hear from you, especially in light of what happens tonight. Would that affect your vote? Would that change your vote? Would you begin to consider another candidate in light of what is going to transpire this evening? And of course, we will have a Democratic debate, and then we will have a Republican debate this week. And of course, we'll try to cover all of that, not only on Thursday and Friday, but maybe even the following week, because there's so much to cover. All of this information available at our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Shamila. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
From Focus Features in association with Motive Entertainment comes The Young Messiah.
You seek your family from Nazareth with a boy named Jesus.
The Young Messiah imagines the journey of Jesus with his family from Egypt to Nazareth and on to Jerusalem, where his identity is revealed and his destiny fulfilled.
He's just a child.
He is not just a child.
In theaters March 11th. Rated PG-13, may not be appropriate for children under 13. More information at youngmessiahresources.com. Are you concerned about what's happening in our colleges, our marketplace, and the halls of government? Let me ask, have you invested in things that yield a good harvest? If you're already giving to Point of View each month, we thank you. You share in the reward for what we harvest. If you're not, now is the time. $30, $65, $100. The more you invest on a regular basis, the more we'll reap together. Give online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Click at the top on Become a Monthly Partner or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.